All right, we made it to the end of the week. It's the Friday edition here of the Morning Pitt on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. You know the deal. You know what we always say. You know what we always talk about. You know what we always ask you to do. Like the video, hit that like button, subscribe to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. We'd appreciate it if you do that. And, of course, go check out the website, Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com for all the Pitt sports coverage, football, basketball, and recruiting. You find it all, Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. You know the deal. You know what we ask you to do. It's the end of the week. You've been hearing me say this for the last 4 days, and then the 5 days before that, and the 5 before that, and the 5 before that, and so on and so forth, all the way dating back to last August or so when we started doing these daily shows. So you know what we want you to do. We want you to check out the website, Panther-Lair.com, and we want you to like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel. So do that. We started this last week on Friday, started doing a mailbag edition of the Morning Pitt. And went pretty, actually no, we started 2 weeks ago. We started 2 weeks ago because 2 weeks ago I put out a call for questions, and we got so many questions that we ended up stretching it over the course of 2 Fridays. I said, well, that went really well. Let's do it every Friday. Let's make it a mailbag edition of the Morning Pitt where I take questions on the Panther-Lair.com message boards, on our premium message board there between 5th and Forbes, and answer as many of them as we can in 20 minutes or 25 minutes or whatever it ends up taking. And we got a lot of great questions already. If you want to get a question in, if you want to participate, you need to be a subscriber to Panther-Lair.com, Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. So go over there and check it out. So let's jump into the questions. I mean, there's some news things, but I think we'll stick to the mailbag thing today, the mailbag concept, and we'll get into the news again to start next week. So the first question comes from Lothrop22. Lothrop Hall, one of the great single dorm rooms, single occupancy dorms on Pitt's campus. I assume Lothrop is still there, although I also kind of assume everything on that side of 5th Avenue has been torn down. So maybe Lothrop Hall is not there anymore. But anyway, Lothrop22 asks, how many additions to the football roster do you see before the first game? And you start, I think when you start on that question, you look at how many open scholarships do they have. Just kind of quick jotting it down on the cocktail napkin, by which I mean sort of glancing over the scholarship board. It looks like right now, they're projected to be at about 81 scholarships. If they don't lose anybody else, they don't add anybody else, they'll be at 81 scholarships, which means they're 4 under the limit of 85. Actually, no, they might be at 80, actually. I just saw another name on the scholarship list that I need to take off. So, I mean, you're looking at 4 or 5 open spots right now. That's your starting point. You would have to think after spring camp, there'll be some attrition. You know, there'll be 1 or 2 guys who decides that they just don't see a role for themselves. They don't have an opportunity, and they go. I was actually having a conversation with someone about this yesterday, standing at practice, watching yesterday morning's practice in the South Side, and we were having a conversation about guys who might go. And the gist of it was, you know, do you think there'll be any starters or top rotation guys who would go? And I don't think so. I don't think you're going to have a situation like the Jordan Addison situation last year. You know, I think they'll probably have a few players transfer after spring camp, but it'll be guys who are down the depth chart, guys who don't see a real opportunity for playing time or a path to playing time. And you'll lose a few of those, so you could end up with 6, 7 open spots, you know, realistically by the time you get to June or something, or by the time you get to May, I guess. So that's what you're going to be working with. And I think they'll fill as many of those spots as they can. I mean, you don't carry them over to next year if you don't use them now. So I think they'll try to get 85 guys. Now, I think there are some guys who potentially could go on scholarship, some walk-ons like Jake McConaughey, or McConaughey. I'm not sure how you pronounce his last name. I apologize. The wide receiver. Both of the punters who are in the punting competition right now, Jeff Yerk and Caleb Junko, are walk-ons. So, I mean, one of those guys or both of those guys could end up on scholarship. Byron Floyd, who we talked about yesterday with Snapper 49, the long snapper could end up on, going on scholarship. So you have a handful of walk-ons on the current roster that could go on scholarship. But I think you're going to see some additions. I think you'll see, I don't know, 3 or 4 guys out of the transfer portal. I could see them bringing in, depending on how many guys end up leaving. If they have, 3 guys leave, and that leaves them with 8 open scholarship spots, and you give a scholarship to your punter, your long snapper, and your favorite walk-on wide receiver, I mean, you still have 5 more spots to give. And again, there's no reason not to use those scholarships on players who can potentially help you if you can find them and get them in. So, I could see as many as 5 more players being added. I don't know if they're going to add 5, but I think that's probably the number you're generally going to be looking at. OH Pete, I assume it's Ohio Pete, says, so far in camp, what position group is the strongest and which is the weakest? Are there any particular positions that Narduzzi will be looking for in the transfer portal, or will those moves be dependent on who decides to leave after spring camp and who is available in the portal? This is a good question. What position group is the strongest and which one's the weakest? I glanced over these questions before we started recording here. Just to, so we know if there's anything I need to look up real quick, have any data or information or research handy. And I glanced over this question, and there was no obvious answer that jumped out as the strongest position group on the team. Maybe cornerback? And I would say that, based on the talent level, the depth, and the returning experience. I think there's a pretty good amount of talent and depth on the defensive line, but not a ton of returning experience. I mean, Devin Danielson, David Green, Tyler Bentley, they played a lot, but none of the defensive ends really have. Dalen Hayes has played a decent amount, but not a ton. And even at tackle, I think they're going to be looking for more guys to step up, so you don't have as much experience at that position. Linebacker, I think, has some talent and some experience, but they don't have a ton of depth. Safety, I think, has talent, but not really a lot of experience, and I'm not sure about the depth. I think the offensive line is pretty strong. I think the offensive line is a pretty strong group with talent, a decent amount of experience, and okay depth. Running back, sort of the same. Pretty good talent, solid amount of experience, and okay depth. But it might be it might be corners. That might be the position I would say is the strongest. And then the weakest, you don't want to be overly negative, but I'm very much taking a wait and see approach when it comes to the wide receivers. Look, I'm still sold on Konate Mumfield. There's this fantasy football podcast I listen to, the Fantasy Footballers podcast. I always cram for fantasy football heading into August, and they do a segment every year. It's My Guys, the My Guys segment, and each of the hosts lists like the 3 guys that they are desperate to try and get on their roster every year in fantasy football. And I mean, if you read content on Panther-Lair.com or listen to these podcasts, I have my guys. Bengali Kamara is very much a my guy. And Konate Mumfield is a my guy. And I've been on that one for a while now, and even if last year it didn't really come through all that consistently or effectively. And I'm still on that one. I still think he's going to be has a chance to be really good. And I think Bub Means has potential as kind of a freak athlete. And I'm intrigued by Dejon Reynolds. And, I think Lamar Seymour can be good. And Kenny Johnson coming in. We really don't know with any of those guys. Outside of Mumfield and a little bit of Means, we really don't know what any of them can be and what any of them can do. And it's not a position group that looks particularly deep. It's not a position group that has a ton of experience. And there are questions about talent, to be quite honest. So, that's probably, I would say it's probably the weakest position group on the team. And again, not to be too harsh or negative about them, but I think when you size it up and you say, okay, what do they actually have here? It's not a whole lot. It could be good by the end of the season, but at this point, it's not a whole lot. The other part of the question, are there any particular positions Narduzzi will be looking for in the transfer portal, or will those moves be dependent on who decides to leave after spring camp and who's available in the portal? Part of it's always going to be dependent on who's available in the portal. I don't know if they'll necessarily go get guys solely because someone left. after spring camp. That's partially because I don't think they're going to have any big, significant contributing players leave. So I don't think it's going to leave a huge hole like Jordan Addison did. I think probably the coaches would look at, wide receiver, like I just mentioned, would probably be a position they would target. They target it when they tried to get Dante Cephas, the wide receiver from Kent State, from Penn Hills. They offered, last week, Jaquay Jackson, the Cal U receiver, who's in the transfer portal. So they're clearly interested in potentially bringing in another wide receiver to help this group. I wouldn't be surprised if they take a look at linebacker. Really like the top group of linebackers. I think Bengali Kamara and Solomon DeShields and Shane Simon can be really good. There's just not a lot of depth behind them. When you're talking about, Braylon Lovelace running on the second team as an early enrolling freshman out of Leechburg. I like this incoming group of freshman linebackers. I like Lovelace. I like Jordan Bass. I think Rasheem Biles can be good. But they could use another experienced player for this year. A Kylan Johnson or a Tyler Wiltz or a Shane Simon. They've done okay getting transfer linebackers in here over the last couple years. They could use another one of those guys this year. So my guess is Pat Narduzzi has even said it. He said it a week or two ago that Ryan Manilak, the linebackers coach, keeps telling him he needs more linebackers. He needs more linebackers. So I wouldn't be surprised if they look at those spots, linebacker and wide receiver, when they go into the transfer portal, in addition to just best player available. If there's a good running back that they can get and is willing to come here and they feel like he can make an impact, they should go get him. A corner, a safety, whatever it is. But I think the priorities are probably wide receiver and linebacker. Chris Rand 24 says, if you had to put bets down on who wins each of the following position battles, who would you pick? Safety, Stephon Hall versus PJ O'Brien. Left tackle, Branson Taylor versus Ryan Baer. Punter, Caleb Junko versus Jeff Yerk. Safety, Steph Hall versus Philip O'Brien. He's going by Philip now. At least that's what it is on Pitt's official roster. Bounce back and forth from Philip to PJ, back to Philip. That one's a close one. I came into spring camp thinking PJ O'Brien was the guy. I came into spring camp thinking, all right, it's going to be Javon McIntyre at the boundary safety, and it's going to be Philip O'Brien at the field safety. And that's it, and that's who it's going to be, because those were the main backups last year. But Steph Hall from Central Valley, redshirt sophomore now, I think, has been one of the surprise players. I think one of the breakout guys in camp this spring. He's really pushing for that job, and maybe even a little bit ahead. I don't know if he's fully taken over the position, but that one might be too close to call right now. That's going to be a real training camp battle. Left tackle with Ryan Baer and Branson Taylor, it's pretty interesting about that one, because there is a battle between Baer and Taylor at left tackle, but Baer is also pushing Ryan Jacoby at left guard. I think what you're seeing right now, what the Pitt coaches are seeing, or what they're looking for, as Dave Borbley pops up on the screen there, they're looking to see if Ryan Baer is truly one of their 5 best linemen. And I think they're finding that the answer to that question is yes, he is. And then that leads to the second question of, okay, who's number 6 then? Because somebody who's expected to be one of the top 5 is now going to be bumped down to number 6. And I think the most likely candidates are Branson Taylor or Ryan Jacoby, one of those linemen on the left side. And the fact that they're willing to use Baer at tackle and guard speaks to the fact that, I think it speaks to the fact that they believe he is one of their 5 best linemen. I don't think they're going to bench Mac Gonsalves. I think Blake Zabovic's set. Jake Cradle is your center. It's going to be Jacoby or Taylor, I think, who ends up dropping down to number 6 if Baer does, in fact, push his way into the starting lineup. So left tackle, Taylor versus Baer, I might lean Taylor just because Baer might end up just playing left guard. Either way, I'm pretty sure Ryan Baer is going to be one of those 5 best and end up in a starting job. He's really impressive. He's been really good. And then the punters, Caleb Junko and Jeff Yerk, I have no idea. I think Yerk has impressed the coaches after transferring in from Elon. Junko set a FBS bowl game record with an 85-yard punt in the Sun Bowl. I thought he did okay on his 12 punts last year. They've both been the better punters in spring camp, ahead of Cam Guess and Sam Vanderhaar. If I had to bet on one of those guys, I don't know. Junko, I guess. slightly, 51-49. I mean, I don't have anything to base that on. I don't know who the coaches view as being ahead in that competition, other than to say that those two are ahead of the other two. But as it comes to those two individually, I don't know if you could put odds on it. Just like I don't know if you could put odds on Stephon Hall versus P.J. O'Brien. It really could be either one of those guys. Panther-Lair.com says, do urban schools like Pitt have more NIL opportunities than a rural school? Does it work like that? I'm just trying to figure out this NIL thing and where the money comes from. Is it just donations from fans? So, that's a great question. And kind of like 2 weeks ago when we got an NIL related question, it sort of ate up a ton of time, because inevitably any question about NIL is a big question that has a lot of tentacles and a lot of angles and a lot of strings to keep in the old duder's head. So to the first part, rural schools versus urban schools, I don't think you would think on the very basic notion of media exposure and advertising opportunities that it would be better in an urban area than it is in a rural area. And probably to some extent it is in those terms. If we just look exclusively at the bubble of advertising opportunities, of endorsement opportunities, of sponsorship opportunities, an urban area is probably a more fertile NIL landscape than a rural area. But I think we've all learned over the last 2 years that NIL is not just about, putting your face on a billboard or, getting a truck for endorsing that dealership. That there's a lot more to it. And so, in the question, who's the question from Panther-Lair.com, is it just donations from fans? And ultimately, the donations from fans are getting run through a collective that then finds ways to use NIL to get the money to the players, right? And it's it has to be done by some letter of some law, but that's ultimately how the donate. I mean, you're not just donating cash directly into a player's pocket; you're donating to a collective that uses that money. It does ultimately get that money to the players, but through name, image, likeness opportunities. And sometimes it creates those opportunities, sometimes it facilitates those opportunities, but that's how it's happening. And that can happen rural or urban, and it largely does depend on the support of the fans. You could be in Morgantown, West Virginia, you could be in State College, you could be in Tuscaloosa, you could be in Norman, Oklahoma, or Lincoln, Nebraska, or any of these places. You could be in Cedar Rapids or someplace. And if the fan support is strong and the donations to that collective group are strong, then there are greater NIL opportunities or a greater opportunity for NIL revenue at those schools than there would be at maybe an urban school that has less, sort of passionate support and less active support. So it's a yes and no. In terms of getting a car dealer, like I said, in terms of endorsements or advertisements or things like that, yeah, there might be better opportunities in an urban area. But you kind of strip away that qualifier when it comes to when you start dealing with things like the collectives, then it becomes less about where you're located and it becomes more about how passionate and how supportive your fan base is. Let's see. Gene's Place. Big fan of Gene's Place. I remember Gene's Place when it was Denny's, right? It was Denny's first because it's Gene's now, right? I remember it being Denny's. I'm old school on that. Gene's Place says, with recent recruiting, is it always the coaches initiating contact with recruits, or are some of these more talented recruits initiating contact with the coaches based on the program being on the rise? I mean, almost always, I can't say 100% because nothing's 100%, but almost always the coaches are establishing the relationship. They're going out to the high school, they're meeting the kid for the first time, they're making contact with the high school coaches and establishing that relationship or through direct messages or over, phone, text messages, whatever it is. They're establishing that relationship and then working to get them on campus. There's probably the rare occasion where a kid reaches out to Pitt and says, hey, I'm interested in you. I'm talking, like a big time kid, a kid with lots of offers and that kind of thing, high rating, stars and all that stuff. They might, it could happen every now and then and say, hey, I want to come and take a look at Pitt. And then the coaches say, oh, we never even thought this guy was interested. Yes, we will absolutely facilitate this. But for the most part, it's the coaches initiating it and working to maintain the relationship. I had this conversation, I talked about it a couple days ago on the Morning Pitt, about how coaches have to work daily, multiple times a day, to keep Pitt in the minds of their top targets, to make sure that those top targets are never not thinking about Pitt. And, part of that is working to get them on campus. So I don't have any specific examples of times when the recruits initiated, but I think it's safe to assume that 95 or more % of this is initiated by the coaches. Let's see. Zelda's Open Roof says, confirm if half of us are right or wrong on that hoops board. Does Jeff Capel bring in someone over 6'8" who can rebound? Probably. My guess would be probably. Of course, the guy they have visiting right now from High Point, Zach Austin, he's like 6'7", and he was the team's leading rebounder. So I'm sorry, I guess he doesn't count because he's not over 6'8". I wouldn't be surprised to see them bring in another center who, if nothing else, could serve as the third emergency backup center behind Federico and Guillermo Diaz-Graham. I said this yesterday or maybe the day before. Maybe it was on the Panther-Lair show on Wednesday night. All these things run together. I'm comfortable. Me, personally, if I'm Jeff Capel, I'm comfortable with Federico and Guillermo Diaz-Graham. I'll give up a little bit on strength, even though they'll add strength in the offseason. I'll give up a little bit on strength, but their length is impossible to coach. And it impacts the game in a positive way. But if you want to bring someone in to back them up because they could get hurt or get in foul trouble or who knows what, I think that's valid. I think it's completely reasonable to do so. You'd have to find a guy who's willing to be the third guy, a guy who's willing to be a backup, and that's not always an easy sell. So I wouldn't make it a priority. I think my priorities are still on the wing and on the perimeter and in the backcourt. But it's something I would keep an eye out for. And if I have an opportunity to get a guy who can give 3 or 4 minutes a game or something like that, then yeah, I'll go get him. He says also, who's better at middle linebacker, Brandon George or Shane Simon? I think Shane Simon is running with the first team. I think Shane Simon is the first team middle linebacker and ahead of Brandon George being behind him. So it seems like he's the better option right now. I mean, Shane Simon played some middle linebacker last year. I don't know if it's enough to say definitively yes or no he's the better option. And certainly, Brandon George hardly played at all last year. So it's hard to judge on where he is right now. But I think Shane Simon's a really good option. I think he knows the defense really well. He obviously played in it all year last year and learned the middle linebacker position from working with and watching Servassier Dennis, which is a pretty good guy to watch and learn from and work with. I spend so much time thinking about the outside linebackers, about Bengali, Kamara, and Solomon DeShields, that I haven't really thought as much about the middle linebacker unit. But I think it's going to be Kamara, Simon, DeShields as your starters, with Brandon George playing a lot and coming in as the backup middle linebacker and potentially even a backup money linebacker, or swapping in for DeShields at times. I think there are different things they can do. Simon might start at middle linebacker, but if DeShields needs a break, maybe Simon plays some snaps at money and Brandon George comes in the middle. I think all 4 guys are going to play a decent amount. Really, my biggest thoughts and concerns as far as the linebackers go, I've been thinking mostly about those 2 starting outside linebackers, Kamara and DeShields, and then trying to figure out who the backups are there. It's sort of easy to figure out middle linebacker. You have Simon and George in one order or another. But the outside linebackers, the depth is not nearly as obvious because there's nobody who's really played there. And so that's what I've been mostly concerned with and trying to figure out, is who's going to be the backup outside linebackers. But that's just me. All right, great questions. We actually still have a lot left, so we'll carry this right over to next week. Of course, it's like it's one of these things where the NIL question always draws a lot of thoughts, because there's no easy, succinct NIL question, or at least there's no easy, succinct answer to an NIL question. So, but keep them coming because I think it's an interesting topic to talk about. I don't always have the answers, but we can usually find someone who does. And I think it's interesting to discuss. So thanks everybody who participated in the mailbag for this week. Thanks everyone who watched the Morning Pit this week and watched the live Panther-Lair show on Wednesday night. That was a lot of fun, as it always is. This is the final week of training camp coming, or spring camp coming up next week. They practice Tuesday, Thursday, and then the spring game at Acrisure Stadium next Saturday. So before we know it, spring camp is going to be over. We'll have all the coverage from spring camp next week on Panther-Lair.com, and of course, we'll be talking about it right here on YouTube.com. So make sure you like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Hope you've had a great week. Hope you have a great Friday. Hope you have a great weekend. And we'll be back to talk to you again Monday morning right here for the Morning Pit on YouTube.com/Panther-Lair.com.